we know our family so much more intimately than our neighbors, as intimately as we may know our neighbors. And so that act of novelistic extrapolation into a postulated reality is easier within our family. You know, in How to Breathe Underwater, the short story collection, there was a short story that's about, that's called The Isabel Fish, where it's a brother and a sister who have survived the death of the brother's girlfriend, to whom the sister was also very close. And in writing this story, I think partly because, you know, I was pretty young when I wrote the story, but also just because it was about a family that in certain ways was similar to my own. The only way for me to write that story, for me to really envision that story, was to say to myself, what if I had had a mean brother instead of a nice brother? You know, or what if tragedy had made my brother cruel instead of kind? You know, and so it's that act of the pursuing of an opposite within the family, or of the pursuing of a condition that didn't exist in the family, that is both, you know, it's both possible because you know your family so intimately, and it's also fruitful because it's different from the actual conditions, and so it creates that kind of, that need, that desire for the exploration that moves you through the writing of a piece.
My grandfather fought in the 1916 rebellion and was interned afterwards. And my uncle, who I was very close to and lived into the 90s, he fought in the Irish Civil War, which was a pretty brutal business. And he was on a hunger strike during that time. So that all of that was always there. And it was very useful. I mean, I used it in a novel, that novel, The Blackwater Lightship. Sorry, I used it in the novel, The Heather Blazing. But when I came to the novel, to write the novel, The Blackwater Lightship, I made a conscious decision to leave it out, that it was too easy almost in an Irish novel to start putting in references to this is where battles were fought, or this revolution affected everyone's life, because I wanted, in a way, to draw a deeper picture. And in order to do so, therefore, I wanted the family to be much more enclosed, with almost no sense of an outside. If the outside began, it began sometime in the 1960s for them. There was no past before that. And fill it with things such as the arrival of the first cell phone in the house, which frightened the cats, which meant they had to run out of the house. The arrival of a television, the arrival of central heating, that those sort of things had to be presented in the book as A, organic, but B, very important in some way or other for shaking up this place. And then offer the characters a sort of an intensity in their relationship to each other. So there are only 6 characters. It takes place over 7 days. And I left Ireland out. I got Ireland and I said, I want you out of my book. I've had enough trouble from you, myself, and novelists have had enough trouble from you, you know, because it's so easy to put in those ingredients of, for example, references to Protestants and Catholics, to sectarian warfare, to independence movements, to insurgencies of various sorts. I thought, I'm having none of it.
I think for about the first 100 pages of this novel, as I was writing the first draft, I kind of felt a dutifulness that made the work feel a little bit heavy to me somehow. I felt like I was doing what needed to be done. I felt like I was sort of doing a good turn in a way by retelling these stories that I knew the family wanted told. And then at a certain point, I realized that the story had to depart, and it was going to depart at the point where this character, this young man in Paris in the late 30s, was going to fall in love. I'm sure my grandfather fell in love in the late 30s in Paris, but those stories are lost to the family now because the person he would have fallen in love with was decidedly not my grandmother. And so perhaps if I had been a man instead of a woman, he would have told me those other stories, but he didn't. And so that was the territory in which I began to invent. And as soon as I knew who and how he was going to fall in love with and how he was going to fall in love in Paris, then the story took a turn toward the fictional. And that was the road that opened up into territory that was completely new, and that I think created the energy that allowed me to really write the novel and not just to be reconstructing.
I mean, I recognize everything you're saying, and it's absolutely an essential business, that you almost need something to start with, as though you need a sound or some beginning, but then you make up the rest. And I think this is what becomes very difficult as you're working, that if you stick to the truth, somehow the truth becomes oddly shapeless, that it doesn't fulfill some immense thing that you wish to achieve, that it gets small and flimsy almost, but that you're very close sometimes as you're working to being a child in bed musing on things. I wonder if my grandfather had gone and instead of marrying her had met a ballerina. In other words, when I wrote that novel I was talking about, The Heather Blazing, the best fun was, I wonder if I had no siblings at all and if my mother died when I was born and if it was just my father and me. Oh, and you curl up in bed as a 9-year-old thinking, wouldn't that be lovely? I could have the house to myself most of the time. None of those would be there. My mother would be annoying me. I just have him, and him and me would go off places. And then you actually start, I mean, it's very childlike.
So what now happens after the 60s and 70s? What's the family novel, in other words, after the families have been transformed in the last 40 years?
Well, they haven't for me in the sense that I was partly brought up in the 19th century. In other words, brought up in a house with no telephone, with no television for quite some time. I mean, I suppose I was 9 or 10 before there was a television, with no central heating. So there was a fire lighting. If you needed to be warm, you went into the room where the fire was. And a sense of an extended family the door was never locked. So anyone could come into the house, and aunts and uncles were permanently wandering in and out. And so feudalism was still going on. And also in a town of 6,000 people where 3 of my grandparents had been born in the town. So that I had, it was very much a very traditional society. I mean, not to mention Catholicism, which you didn't even mention because it was so it was just there. I mean, you just didn't even think about it. It was just the daily business of prayers and belief. There was no one who didn't believe. We had Protestants living next door, but they were very unusual. They were, and they even had a fridge, which we didn't have. Having those roots in the night and watching the sort of slow disruption of those roots, I suppose, has been interesting and fruitful.